Hello to all of my members and welcome to this exclusive Fox step-by-step watercolour tutorial. And I'd just like to say thank you to everyone on my Patreon membership who voted for the Fox on my recent Patreon poll. So, shall we get started? My first stage is to draw the fox, and I've used an HB pencil on cold press watercolour paper. It's on a block, it measures 12 by 16 inches, and I've used some washi tape to tape around the edge so you get a really nice white border. The sketch outline can be found below the description just above the comments, and the materials list with the colours that I've used plus colour alternatives and the photo link can also be found in the description. For my second stage, I'm going to use some masking fluid, blue masking fluid, to mask out really sort of small light areas. That's the highlights in the eyes, sort of light areas around the fox's mouth, and just sort of those little very light hairs at the edge of his sort of outside of his body. Just anything that you're going to find tricky to sort of reserve. However, if you don't have masking fluid or you don't like using masking fluid, you can use white gouache, which I do actually use at the end of this painting as well. So there's always alternatives. So I'm going to allow my masking fluid to dry naturally, and for my third stage, I'm going to paint the background. I'm mixing a big watery puddle of ultramarine and burnt sienna. You could use cobalt blue or burnt umber. So it's a really big puddle, and now I am wetting the background with a 1-inch flat soft head brush. Just use a large brush to wet the background carefully around the fox. You don't want to wet the fox because you don't want the background to seep onto the fox. So I'm carefully wetting around the fox, loading my brush now and painting the background. This is a very light colour. I just wanted to give a tint to this snowy background and not just leave it white. So I'm just sort of applying this liberally all around the fox there with this large flat 1-inch brush. If you do get some puddles, just tilt your painting and allow the puddles to go towards the edge where you can lift off with your brush. So I'm just painting here on the left hand side, working carefully around the edge of the fox there, and just really loading my brush, and I'm going to paint the negative spaces between the fox's leg and body as well. You may want to swap to a smaller brush. It may give you more confidence to paint these sort of smaller, trickier areas. I'm just using the corner of this flat brush. So I am mixing up now the same colour, ultramarine and burnt sienna, slightly creamier, and I'm painting damp into damp. So the surface is no longer wet, it's damp. So there's still a sheen on the watercolour paper. And always take off the excess paint on your paper towel so you can control it. What you don't want to do is have these sort of tree trunks and branches sort of spread too much, and that's what happens when the paint is wet or the surface is wet. So this way the surface is damp and the paint is damp, so just keep taking off that excess on your paper towel and make sure that paint is slightly creamier. That will make it darker as well, and just kind of liberally paint these sort of tree trunks and branches. And I've actually used some artistic license. I've not exactly copied the photograph. I've put lots of just tree trunks and branches behind the fox as and where I sort of fancy in a way. This is slightly creamier paint now, thicker. Again, I've taken the excess off on my paper towel. So I'm just painting a few darker tree trunks and branches just to create some depth in that background there, keeping some a little bit paler, but these branches here to the left a touch darker. And it's good practice to do this exercise, working damp into damp. And if you're a little bit worried about it, you could paint this wet on dry over your light wash background using just pale colours for the tree trunks and branches. Again, there's other ways of sort of painting in watercolour. It's not just one set way. So that's another way, especially if you're a beginner and you're worried about painting damp into damp. So I'm just continuing on here, just painting these darks with my size 6 round brush, painting up to the edge of the fox, being careful not to sort of go over the edge there. So take your time, and as I said, if you're worried about painting damp into damp, just allow the painting to dry. Even if you allow the sort of paler sort of tree trunks and branches, do that damp into damp, let that dry. So the darker ones you could paint wet on dry later. So there's lots of choices. And remember to breathe, remember to enjoy yourself, and don't be too hard on yourself. Keep it simple, don't overthink it. So I'm just mixing again. As you can see, there's hardly any water in that wash. Still the ultramarine and burnt sienna, about 50-50, and just sort of painting over some of these tree trunks just on the right here, carefully with the size 6 brush, painting again damp into damp. I'm going to allow my background to dry, and what I've done now is I've mixed up a puddle of ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm just painting this wet on dry at the bottom of the trees with my size 10 brush, and then just diluting the top edge there just to kind of make it fade away, using a clean damp brush, painting the negative spaces in between the fox's leg and body here as well, still using that dilute ultramarine burnt sienna, and then blending with a clean damp brush at the top edge. Again, painting on the right here, rinsing my brush and just blending. I usually start above and then work my way down so you don't sort of pull too much dark paint up. And I'm just adding a touch more dark just at the bottom there. And that really does push the background back and make the snow look really white. And what I'm doing now is sprinkling some salt onto the damp paint, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally. For my fourth stage, I'm going to be working with light and mid-tone washes, working wet into wet, damp into wet, and damp into damp. But first of all, I'm going to brush off the salt with my paper towel. So make sure your painting is dry. You don't want to smear the paint. And here's a close-up, and you can see the lovely textures behind the fox in the background there that the salt has made. What it does, it absorbs the paint to create lovely light textures. So what I'm doing now is I am mixing up a puddle of raw sienna and then raw sienna with some Paynes grey to make it slightly darker and sludgier. Also a little bit of cadmium yellow and Winsor Red to make an orange here. I've actually added a touch of raw sienna to that as well. To help you, I'm just going to work in small sections, working wet into wet. So I'm going to wet the fox's face with my size 10 brush. Working in these smaller sections will give you time and control, and hopefully you won't panic. So you know, you're working with light washes, wet in wet. So I'm starting off with the raw sienna, wet in wet with my size 10 brush, just painting the inside of the ears there. Now, if anything goes wrong at this stage, you can always just wet the area with clean water and lift off with a paper towel, wet it again and start again. So, you know, just try to free up at this stage and enjoy it. So I'm just painting his face with raw sienna, leaving some white areas as well. And remember, there is masking fluid protecting the white areas, and you can use white paint later as well. So I'm using the raw sienna now with a touch of Paynes grey, just painting that wet into wet, and I'm painting the red orange colour now with my size 6 brush. Painting is a little bit more damp into wet, so take off that excess paint on your paper towel to make sure it doesn't run too much. I want it to sort of stay in place but create a soft edge at the same time. So I'm painting the top part of his head there with that red orange and just working my way around his face, working damp into wet using my size 6 brush. And what I'm trying to do is just to paint the sort of hairs that you can see on the fox's face, all these little markings, but they're all kind of got soft edges. And later on I'll be painting wet on dry to build up darks and details as well. So this is the kind of underpainting. So take your time, don't go too dark. Remember, these are light washes. And we're almost, I always think of painting as like you're a sculptor and you've just got your tools now and you've got your great big piece of marble and you're chiseling away just to get basic shapes. So you don't want to do too much at this stage. You just want to kind of form that shape. So what I'm doing now is I'm just wetting underneath the fox's chin there and on the side of his body. So again, another small section. There's a lot of white here, but I want to paint some shadows as well. So I'm using that raw sienna Sienna with a touch of Paynes grey, painting wet into wet, and a little bit of warm colour as well, a little bit more raw sienna. And remember, I have got masking fluid protecting some of the white of the paper. So I'm using that dilute red orange there, painting wet into wet, some of the sort of darker, warmer areas here on the fox's body, using my size 6 brush and just making all these small marks here and there, working my way around the edge, building up this sort of image here of the fox using these light washes. So still using my size 6 brush, I've got a tiny bit more burnt sienna here, slightly creamier, so painting damp into wet, so the paint doesn't run as much, just building up sort of more sort of light to mid-tonal values here. I'm using Paynes grey now, about 80% Paynes grey, 20% burnt sienna, just painting a little bit of dark just underneath the fox's tongue there, and just painting damp into damp now, just to build up some little bit more mid-tonal values here, using the tip of my brush, working my way around the fox's face there, and just painting those marks damp into damp. Remember, less is more. Try not to lose too much of your white and light in this area, because there is a lot of white. So I'm just almost half closing my eyes to see the little darks here and there, using that Paynes grey with the burnt sienna now, painting damp into damp, the sort of underneath shadows on the fox's face, so to create depth. So the nose looks like it's coming forward, it looks more 3D, adding a little bit more of that red-orange colour as well, damp into damp, really kind of sculpting the fox's face, making it look more 3D, building up these sort of soft shadow colours here, painting damp into damp, the centre of the fox's forehead, working my way around with this burnt sienna and Paynes grey wash, even into the ears now, building up here. So these are kind of light, almost going into mid-tone washes, and they do dry so much paler. So be a little bit braver, because sometimes when they dry very light, you've almost got to do another sort of layer. So just be brave, just building up those washes. I've decided to use a ready-made orange. I just thought it'd make my life a little bit easier, but I hope it does make yours if you have some. You can still use the red and yellow mix, but I just felt it would be a little bit quicker, especially as I'm working damp into wet or damp into damp. So it's quite a bright orange, but you can use a little bit of yellow, a little bit of raw sienna, or even burnt sienna to kind of tone it down a little bit. So I've actually used some yellow here on the top right of the fox's shoulder area. So I've used the orange mixed with the yellow to create sort of a lighter area. And if you look sort of in the middle area of the fox's back, it's got lots of different shades of orange, yellow orange, orange, slightly red orange, more a burnt sienna orange colour. It's got some wonderful different sort of colour mixes. So I'm just using my size 10 brush and just softening that edge there, blending out that yellow orange into the middle of the back. So another section to work in here, wet into wet. Now yours doesn't have to be as big as this, just work at the size that you feel comfortable, wet that area and then begin. So I'm using some raw sienna there to begin with, and now a little bit of that red orange that I made later. That was with the Winsor Red with a touch of the yellow. So just painting this damp into damp here, sort of buffing up to that yellow orange to the left, and just sort of painting these marks here on the body of the fox, painting the orange here and there. So remember, vary your colours. And just loading my brush now with burnt sienna with a touch of that red orange, and working my way down to the leg area, adding a touch of orange there, rinsing my brush and blending. Adding a touch more orange, creamy orange, working damp into damp, a little bit of the Paynes grey with the burnt sienna as well, blending with the tip of my brush, sort of again painting these sort of marks there to create the look of hairs, doing the same in the middle of the top part of his back, painting damp into damp with the burnt sienna now, which are probably about 80% burnt sienna with about 20% Paynes grey to make a darker brown colour. and painting damp into damp here, using the tip of my brush, using a little bit more of the sort of orange, yellow orange, again working damp into damp, using these thin sort of lines to create the look and texture of the fox's coat. With these mid-tone washes, painting damp into damp with my size 10 brush. Picking up a little bit more of that burnt sienna mixed with the Paynes grey, so you've got a mid brown here, painting damp into damp, just smaller sections, half closing my eyes to see some of these sort of mid-tonal values. So I'm actually painting the fox's leg here wet on dry to begin with. I've started with a little bit of orange on the right hand side, then using the burnt sienna and Paynes grey on the left. It's slightly darker on the left, there's light catching the back of the fox's legs, using my size 6 brush here and just blending, using a little bit more dark here on the left, and that's a bit more Paynes grey mixed in with that burnt sienna now, carefully working my way down, wet on dry, just on the outside left there, and adding some orange on the right and letting it bleed together in the middle there, working my way down to the feet area. I'm using raw sienna and painting the tip of the toes there, it's a little bit lighter, wet on dry, and I'm just bringing the paint now, the burnt sienna, down to the toe area and blending that. So you've still got the light at the edge of the toes there. Mixing up some Paynes grey and burnt sienna here and just painting damp into damp now with my size 6 brush just at the edge of the leg there on the left hand side, so you've really got that contrast. So this is pretty much darks here, so I've sort of gone a little bit from my light to mid-tones to some darks, but I'm not going to do too much more to these legs here, so I'm kind of doing it all in one go. So just blending here with the tip of my brush with this creamy dark colour, cutting into the light hairs at the top there as well, bringing it down to the feet and painting some darks there, damp into damp in the toe area, just for some little details, using the tip of my size 6 brush. And just painting some hairs at the back of the legs there. I love little details like that, just using the tip of my brush. You can just use the paint that's actually there and pull that out to the right, wet on dry. So I'm painting the next leg here using similar techniques. I've mixed up some burnt sienna here and painting damp into damp there, pushing it into that orange at the top of the leg, and then painting wet on dry as I work my way down to the leg, to the feet, and using the tip of the brush there just to really sort of refine the details here. What I'm doing now is I'm rinsing my brush. I'm going to get some more of that raw sienna there and paint the toes, that lighter colour, wet on dry, using the tip of my brush, rinsing again, taking the excess paint off my paper towel, and then blending that raw sienna up into the darker paint. Damp into damp, and just using some mid-tone here, burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey, and pushing that up again at the top of the leg, damp into damp, just to create sort of these light and mid-tones and slightly darker tones, especially on the leg here. I'm sort of working with the Paynes grey, literally with a touch of burnt sienna here to paint some of the darks on the leg, damp into damp, and then the toe area, painting damp into damp, the detail there with the Paynes grey and the burnt sienna mix. I thought it'd be quite nice to use a cocktail stick to pull out some of the wet paint to create the hairs at the back of the fox's legs. So I am painting the back of the fox here. I'm starting off, because the colours slightly change in this area, so working wet into wet. I've wet the surface first, and now I'm using some raw sienna with my size 10 brush and just building up, working light to dark, sort of at the top of the hind legs as well, working my way down that leg there, wetting the legs with raw sienna, both legs, and then adding a touch of orange here to the right of this right leg, at the back of the leg there, and just sort of working wet on dry and wet into wet in some areas, and then using a little bit more of the raw sienna with a touch of that orange there, and just painting damp now into wet and adding a touch more orange there to the left. These legs are slightly lighter in places than the two front legs, and I'm just using a little bit more orange here at the back of the fox, and just blending as well And now this is a little bit of the burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey, and I'm working pretty much wet on dry in this area using the tip of my brush. There's a lot of white at the front of that back leg, so I want to keep that as well. So I'm just carefully going here, building up the colours pretty much in this area, working damp into damp now. This is a touch more Paynes grey, quite dark, painting this damp into damp just at the sort of top of the leg here, using the tip of my brush. Just little marks just here and there, just to build up this detail. Now sometimes your painting may dry a little bit, so it's a good idea to use a spritzer bottle and gently spritz an area that you're working in, so it gives you more time. Just don't over spritz because you'll make puddles. You just want to kind of re-wet the paint or just stop it from drying out. So I'm painting small marks here, damp into damp, with the burnt sienna and Paynes grey mix. It's not as sort of rusty and orangey in this area. Just painting the sort of front of the toes here using the raw sienna. I'm just sort of diluting and blending that with a clean damp brush. I've mixed up again some burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey and painting damp into damp now, some slightly more mid-tone marks here, creating that sort of texture on the fox's coat at the back here, and just building up that detail. I'm actually using more Paynes grey in the hind legs, but a touch more water so it's not quite as dark. It's slightly cooler in colour, not as much of the burnt sienna. And just painting this damp into damp, leaving lots of more lighter areas in these hind legs. The front legs were quite dark. So painting the fox's tail now, I've just started off with a little bit of orange there and some raw sienna, painting wet on dry and then adding lots of water there to dilute the paint directly onto the paper, adding a touch of burnt sienna as well, quite dilute, working my way down to the tip of the tail there using my size 10 brush, and then softening and blending with a clean damp brush and lifting off at the bottom of the tail where it's much lighter with my paper towel. So I'm painting using again the burnt sienna with the Paynes grey. You can use ultramarine as a substitute for the Paynes grey with the burnt sienna. I'm painting damp into damp here, some of the mid-tones at the top of the tail where it sort of meets the body, and cutting in as well to those light hairs at the back of his body there, and just working my way down. So you've got that light against dark in that area at the top of the tail where it meets the body, and just painting the right hand side of the tail there with the tip of my brush, and also making marks in the center of the tail, pretty much working wet into wet in the middle there, and just using the tip of my brush to work around the back of the leg there, just to sort of build up that sort of light and mid-tone. This is quite a creamy colour here, just painting damp into damp, a little bit of a darker tonal value. So yes, mostly this sort of stage of the painting is light and mid-tones, but I thought it'd be quite nice just in these areas to add a few darks there where I had the opportunity, working damp into damp. So the face has dried off a little bit, so it's given me an opportunity to paint the fox's nose and a little bit around the mouth, adding a very dilute pink. I'm also going back to the eyes there, adding a little bit more burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey, using my size 6 round brush, pretty much wet on dry. But I think it's a good idea now to allow the painting to dry. And for my 5th stage, I'm going to be concentrating on mid and darker tonal values. So I'm working on the eyes. The eyes to me are the star of the show. It engages the viewer. So I have got the highlights of the eye masked out. So I'm just using Paynes grey now, wet on dry with my size 6 round brush, and just painting in the details here. Sort of almost the outline of the eye, and then sort of in the corners a little bit more of a thicker line, and then maybe a little bit more shadow around the sort of eye here, and then blending with a clean damp brush. I've also added some burnt sienna in there to warm up that area, wet in wet. And I'm just painting some shadows around the left hand side of the nose here with my size 4 brush, and just working sort of underneath the eye, and it really creates a 3D look by adding these shadows and shapes the face as well. Using some Paynes grey here, working damp into damp, building up the shadows, softening that edge with a clean damp brush, and adding some more darks and details in the eye here. Using the Paynes grey, just building up those darks there, using my size 4 round brush, and blending as well with a clean damp brush. Just painting some darks around the nose area here, painting in the nostrils with some Paynes grey wet on dry. Still using that size 4 brush, and just painting a little bit of dark here, darks and details around this area, working wet on dry, working my way down to the mouth, shaping the mouth area with the Paynes grey, and adding a few little marks there with the Paynes grey around the nose area as well. Adding a touch of burnt sienna to the bridge of the nose there, and then diluting with a very wet brush actually, just to blend that colour up into the forehead area as well, almost like a glaze. And remember, the lighter areas are still masked out with masking fluid, so you can have a little bit of fun developing the face, building up the darks, the details here. I'm using burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey and just painting this warm dark underneath the left eye area here, and adding a little bit of Paynes grey into the sort of iris area of the fox's eyes. I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I felt I was losing a little bit of control there, so I'm using some burnt sienna and just painting some hairs and details here, wet on dry with my size 6 round brush, with a mixture of the burnt sienna with a tiny touch of Paynes grey, so it just darkens it, and just building up these darks around the eyes and around the edge of the nose, left and right there, to make the face and the nose look quite 3D, working my way up the forehead, working wet on dry, still with that burnt sienna with a touch of Paynes grey. And you can vary that colour as well. You can even add a touch of red or even orange to it as well. I'm just wetting this area of the nose and lifting off with my paper towel. I felt I lost the light there, and just painting a little bit more dark around the edge of the nose area, and at the just below the ears here, working wet on dry again with the burnt sienna and a touch of Paynes grey, left and right, just below the ears, using the tip of my brush to create that texture and marks there on the fox's fur coat. Just working my way up into the ears here. I've added a touch more Paynes grey to make a very dark brown, painting wet on dry. I've just diluted my brush there just to sort of dilute that paint to the right hand side there, because it's lighter on the right hand side of the ear, I'm painting again wet on dry here with the dark to the left here, using the Paynes grey with a touch of burnt sienna, using the tip of my brush, just sort of cutting into that lighter area in the fox's ears. When you start painting these darks and details, it really does bring the fox to life as well. I'm just building up the textures using the Paynes grey with the burnt sienna, touch of orange here and there, adding some sort of mid brown here, just building up those ears. And I'm actually painting the dark edge of the ears here using the Paynes grey with a touch of burnt sienna. This is pretty much wet on dry, using my size 6 brown brush, carefully painting around the edge here. You may want to wait for the ears to dry to do this in case this dark bleeds into the fox, and it really does pull him away from the background as well. And I'm just painting some little fine hairs on the edge of this dark as well. I think it's a good idea to allow the painting to dry. And what I'm doing now is just building up some warmth here using burnt sienna on the bridge of the fox's nose, and then blending with a clean damp brush and adding some of that warmth here and there as well to give that lovely sort of characteristic warm red colour on the fox. I felt that I'd gone too far in with the ears left and right here, so I've lifted them out using a clean damp brush and my paper towel, and I'm just going to paint that in again, just making them slightly smaller. So if you ever do anything like that, don't feel you can't change it. You can just lift off with the water, clean damp brush, and then the paper towel. I also felt his legs looked a little bit sort of not realistic. They look like sort of table legs. So I'm just softening here and there with a clean damp brush, adding some orange as well, just to break up that dark here and there. It makes them look more realistic, less sort of like table legs. So just using the tip of my brush, working wet on dry, just building up little darks and details here, varying the colours using burnt sienna, touch of orange, maybe burnt sienna mixed with the Paynes grey as well for some darks here and there. Painting this under his chin here using the burnt sienna, and then burnt sienna mixed with Paynes grey, using my size 10 brush, just diluting and blending here out to the lighter hairs there where it's a lot more white. But you want these darks to make the lights look lighter. And in this area I've actually used Ultramarine with burnt sienna, quite a pale mix, wet on dry, to create some light shadows here. Using a little bit of the burnt sienna with the Paynes grey here, and just painting some details on the edges of the legs, again to make them look a little less like table legs, more realistic. So I've mixed up some orange with the burnt sienna here. I'm painting wet on dry. There's a little bit more of a darker tonal value here using my size 10 brush, but again painting these marks to give the illusion of the hair on the fox, and working my way down to the top of the leg here. But you want to sort of paint these sort of fine details to blend in and to with the sort of lighter colours on the fox's fur as well, using a touch more of that burnt sienna and Paynes grey, painting wet into wet here, building up some of the darks here. So as you can see here, I'm using my size 10 round brush and just painting some marks wet on dry. Sort of some of them are slightly darker, this area here a little bit lighter. So you can vary your tonal values and colours as well. Pretty much using the burnt sienna, you can use raw sienna as well, some dilute orange. Here again I'm using that burnt sienna mix with a touch of Paynes grey. It's had a lot of use in this painting. But you want to keep that lovely orangey look here and there as well. So I'm just working my way here, painting in the detail, building it up. There's so much detail here, and it's fun to do. You can sort of spend hours sort of painting all these different marks, building up that detail, working light to dark. I'm actually just glazing some orange, dilute orange here on the face, just to warm up the fox, to make him look like more like a fox with the colours. and just again sort of building up the marks here at the back of the fox, still using my size 10 brush, still building up those darks and details. I got a bit carried away there. It's a good idea now to allow the painting to dry. What I'm doing now is I'm rubbing off the masking fluid with my paper towel. You can see the fox is kind of looking at you because he's got those little highlights and light in the eyes. Now sometimes when I find I take off masking fluid, you get these hard, awkward edges. So I'm just going around here, just softening with my little Eradicator brush. A link for the brush can be found in the description, but you can use a hog hair brush, an old synthetic brush. Don't use your good watercolour brushes because you could ruin the tips of them. But it just makes everything look softer, and it's a good idea to create that look of hair as well. It's a really nice technique. As you can see, I'm just lifting and softening, and you can lift off a little bit with your paper towel as well, and that creates more light, and then you can add some more details, damp into damp, as I'm doing here on the fox's tail. Now I thought it'd be a good opportunity to take a look at the fox. So I've taken a photograph, and I really recommend this before you continue on painting, because there is a danger sometimes you can overwork it, but it's a good time to check your drawing. I find sometimes with portrait painting, especially when I'm applying lots of washes, I can actually lose my drawing. And I did actually look at this the following day. I've done this over a 2-day period, and I just noticed the nose was slightly to the right. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to show you how I correct that. So I'm lifting off again with my little Eradicator brush, just working in there with clean water and my paper towel. So I'm also shifting the mouth as well a little, just to line everything up correctly. So never panic when you have to do this. Watercolour isn't permanent. You can lift off, and as long as you put paint back after you've lifted off, you can sort of disguise the lifting off. But I thought it'd be quite nice to lift off some other areas to soften, but also to give that lovely soft look of the fur as well. I'm using my Stencil brush, which is like a hog hair brush, and it's a lot more robust in certain areas, so I got a bit carried away here lifting off, but it really does give that lovely softness to the fur. So that's what I'm doing, and also getting some light back as well. So just finishing off lifting off here on the tail, because it's very light on the tip of the tail there. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry, and I'm just building up now with the darks and the details. I'm using my size 6 round brush. I'm just using some Paynes grey, painting in the nostrils and just the outside edge of the nose. So I've just moved it now to the left. It looks a little bit more central. It would have always bothered me if I hadn't have done this. And I'm just painting around the edge very carefully, really sort of bringing this nose to life with the detail, and working my way down to the mouth here, and just underneath the nose and the tongue that's coming out as well. I'm going to outline that as well. So as you can see, I'm really taking my time, keep looking at the photograph just to make sure I've got everything lined up now. Just painting a touch of the dark at the top of the nose, still using that Paynes grey, wet on dry, and just painting a few sort of textured details on the bridge of the nose using some burnt sienna, wet on dry. I'm just using some orange here, wet on dry, with my size 6 brush, just to obviously give them that characteristic fox colour. And I'm just adding it here and there to really warm up the face, the top of the head there. And sometimes when you lift off, you need to put back paint. So I'm just using a little bit of raw sienna here and there, just building up some of the textures and lighter details. Using my size 6 brush, again with a mixture of that burnt sienna and Paynes grey, just painting the tip of the tail here using the tip of my brush. I'm just trying to keep it really light there, but adding some textures and details, wet on dry, painting a few little more dark marks on the toe area of the feet here and there, just to really plant his feet in the ground as well. So once the painting is dry, you can use white gouache or white watercolour or even white acrylic to paint some light areas on the fox. This is great, especially if you haven't used any masking fluid or you've lost the light in your painting. So I'm just adding wet on dry just here and there, this lovely white gouache. Sometimes it can really rescue your paintings. I mean, I actually really enjoy using it, especially in this instance, just to create the look of these sort of fine lighter hairs just here and there. So getting towards the end of the painting now, I'm mixing up some ultramarine with some of that orange. You can use burnt sienna, a big watery puddle, and I'm painting with my size 8 brush. I should actually be painting with a larger brush, large area, large brush. Probably got a bit carried away here, but just directly under the feet, wet on dry. It's this large shadow. It's not that obvious in the photograph, but it really does ground the fox as well. Otherwise you've got that big white blanket of snow. So I've got a little bit of dry brush effect there as well to give a bit of sparkle in my painting, and I'm just sort of painting a few little marks just here and there as well at the edge of that shadow colour, just to have a broken edges so it kind of doesn't have a hard edge to cut the foreground in half. A few little marks just on the left hand side there, looks like little footprints maybe in the snow. And I'm just going back to the face here just to paint a few more little darks and details around the eyes, which are the stars of the show, and also the whiskers. I left these to last using Paynes grey, painting wet on dry, a few little marks here. And to stop myself from doing any more painting, because it was irresistible, I'm just spattering with some white and orange just here and there. You don't have to do that stage. It's just what I do to stop myself from overworking. And any little spatters that you don't like, you can lift off with a paper towel. So here is the finished painting. I've removed the washi tape to reveal a white border, and it also gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to the painting. I think I'll leave it there for now. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, building up from light to dark, those soft wet in wet marks to that textured detail at the end. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to share your work, you can do so on the members private Facebook group. And a link for the group can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy fox painting. Bye for now.